Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in. Today, we are breaking down Professor John Mearsheimer's absolutely fascinating realist analysis of the current US-Iran conflict. We're going to map out a complex, high-stakes geopolitical puzzle that is literally impacting the entire globe. That was, in effect, a surrender document. Okay, let's really dive into this because that is Mearsheimer's boldest claim about the June 17 Memorandum of Understanding. Think about that for a second. He is arguing that the United States essentially surrendered to Iran due to a massive military failure. So how exactly did we get to such a shocking point? To understand this new geopolitical reality, here is our roadmap for the analysis. First, the failed quick victory. Second, the June 17 agreement. Third, Iran's economic leverage. Fourth, Israel sits it out. And finally, the China and Russia factor. Section 1, the failed quick victory. Or, as I like to think of it, shock, awe, and reality. The initial US and Israeli goal was pretty straightforward, right? A quick regime change achieved through a massive shock and awe campaign. But, as Mearsheimer details, that plan spectacularly missed the mark. Just look at how fast things fell apart. In April 2026, a 40-day strategic bombing campaign absolutely failed to break Iranian resolve. So, the strategy pivots to sea power. From mid-April to June, they attempt a naval blockade, and, well, that fails too. This incredibly resilient Iranian defense ultimately forced the June 17 Memorandum of Understanding. So, air power and sea power collapsed. But what about land power? 6,000. Think about that number for a moment. Mearsheimer estimates that 6,000 is the absolute maximum number of actual U.S. combat troops, the literal trigger pullers, currently stationed in the region. Whenever someone casually brings up a land invasion, this number sets up the absolute absurdity of that idea. The crucial point here is this staggering asymmetry. You have a U.S. combat force of under 10,000 troops going up against the Iranian reality, a nation of 93 million people, a formidable military, and incredibly forbidding terrain. Mearsheimer objectively points out that a land invasion is, frankly, laughable. The U.S. simply has no viable land option to conquer significant parts of the country. So with air, sea, and land options essentially off the table, what happens? We enter this highly dangerous tit-for-tat strategy. Iran isn't just passively absorbing strikes anymore. They are actively targeting regional U.S. bases, radar systems, and personnel in places like Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, and Oman. And Mearsheimer notes something crucial here. They might actually be inflicting more damage on U.S. assets than vice versa. Moving on to Section 2, the June 17 Agreement. Surrender or strategy? We know the military options basically stalled out. But why exactly did President Trump agree to this specific Memorandum of Understanding, which Mearsheimer views as such a massive win for Iran?
Well, President Trump's rationale was surprisingly stark. He explicitly stated, "I signed the Memorandum of Understanding because I thought if I didn't, we would face an economic catastrophe." He didn't want to be the next Herbert Hoover presiding over a massive crash. He fundamentally acknowledged that Iran held the ultimate economic cards.
But, the peace just didn't last. And it all boils down to Article 5 of the MOU. This clause effectively ceded control of the Strait of Hormuz to Iran. But the U.S. wasn't exactly thrilled with that interpretation and tried to set up an independent escort channel. That reneging sparked the current escalation, leading both sides to reinstate their blockades. Which brings us perfectly to the core of Iran's power. Section 3, Iran's economic leverage, or the oil choke point. We are now talking about the literal nuclear option of economic leverage that Iran wields over the entire global energy market. The math behind this blockade is wild. Normally, 20% of the world's oil flows right through the Gulf. When the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, 13% of that global supply is entirely cut off. However, there is a tiny 7% sliver still squeezing through bypass pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE over to the Red Sea. That 7% is the only thing currently keeping the international economy from going off a cliff. But watch how this sequence builds into an absolute global nightmare. Step 1, the U.S. threatens Iran's power networks. Step 2, Iran retaliates by shutting down the UAE's Fragile port. Step 3, Iran tells their allies, the Houthis, to shut down the Bab el-Mandab Strait in the Red Sea. And Step 4, that final, precious 7% pipeline bypass is completely severed. This coordinated leverage is just profound. So why exactly is Iran holding a winning hand here? Mearsheimer points to a few strategic aces up their sleeve. First, they are incredibly accustomed to heavy sanctions and suffering. Second, they're fighting what they view as an existential threat, meaning they won't just fold under pressure. Third, they have the ability to literally tank the global economy. And finally, by dragging this out, they are forcing the US to deplete precious, expensive munitions that are desperately needed for other global theaters, like Asia. All right, Section 4. Israel sits it out, sidelined ambitions. Let's impartially examine a very paradoxical role here. Israel pushed heavily for the initial war, but as Mearsheimer observes, they are now conspicuously absent from the current tit-for-tat hostilities. It's fascinating to contrast their initial posture with their current reality. They were massive champions of the 40-day shock and awe campaign, but right now, they are totally sidelined, effectively passing the buck to the US. Why? Well, during that 40-day war, Israel was heavily targeted by Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. They learned a harsh lesson and simply do not want to become a magnet for further retaliation. Instead, Israel's true focus has shifted. They're redirecting their military attention toward battling Hezbollah in Lebanon and consolidating territorial control down in southern Syria. In fact, Article 1 of that June 17 MOU specifically dealt with Lebanon. Israel would much rather let the US handle Iran so it can deal with the immediate threats right on its own borders. But there are some deep, unintended consequences to this war. Mearsheimer actually calls it the death of regional hegemony for Israel. Iran is emerging much stronger. The initial goal to fracture or decapitate the Iranian regime completely failed. And now the balance of power has shifted so drastically that Israel is viewing Turkey as its next major regional threat. The dream of unmatched Middle Eastern dominance has been severely damaged. Now let's zoom out for Section 5, the China and Russia factor, and the global winners. We need to look at how the world's other superpowers are capitalizing on this massive Middle Eastern distraction. Take a look at the wider geopolitical scorecard. For China, Russia, and Iran, their status? Winner, winner, winner. The reasons are simple but incredible. The US is completely distracted from Asia, which is great for China. The US is distracted from Ukraine, benefiting Russia. And Iran benefits by keeping US forces pinned down while gaining valuable intelligence from its allies. America's strategic rivals are the biggest beneficiaries of this protracted war. For Beijing, Mearsheimer literally describes this as manna from heaven. The US has desperately wanted to execute a strategic pivot to East Asia to contain China, but this Middle Eastern war basically forces the US to abandon that pivot, leaving China unchecked in its own backyard. China is perfectly happy to see the US bogged down, and they're reportedly even sharing intelligence to ensure Iran holds its ground. And then there's the contrast with Ukraine. The US is now trying to balance two incredibly draining conflicts at once. Despite President Trump pushing for an accelerated long-range drone war against Russia, Mearsheimer's realist assessment is that Russia is slowly winning the grinding battlefield war of attrition against a manpower-depleted Ukraine. So the US is juggling these two massive crises with potentially disastrous global consequences. All of this brings us to Mearsheimer's incredibly somber realist conclusion. I don't see how you can tell a plausible story as to how you end up with meaningful peace agreements in either one of those regions. This analysis paints a tough picture of a superpower stuck playing a losing hand, burning through precious munitions, with absolutely no easy off-ramps in sight. So, what does this all mean? It leaves us with a final, provocative question. Can military might actually solve a war where the enemy holds the entire global economy hostage? It really forces us to reconsider the absolute limits of superpower military strength in our highly interconnected world. That is what you should take away from this analysis. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see on the geopolitical chessboard.